So 1 cup of Crisco is going into the 2 cups of flour and a tablespoon or 2 of sugar. And that comes out of there nicely. And then I use a pastry cutter. Some people just use like 2 knives, two butter knives and cut like this. I just like a pastry cutter. So I'm going to blend all of those ingredients. And it doesn't necessarily blend, you know, like when you add liquid, because you're adding mostly just solid. So it's just chunking it up in there. Knocking stuff off and doing it again. And you're looking to have a crumbly mess in here when it's well mixed. Okay, can you see that all right? So there's just chunks of stuff in here. To this, I'm going to add, I've already prepared ice in a 1/2 cup of water. So you want the water as cold as you can get it. I add a little bit less than 1/2 cup, but more than 1/3 of a cup. So it's kind of a variation there. And don't put the ice cube in, that'll make a mess. So just dump in most of that, but you can see I've left a little bit of water down in the bottom here. Okay, this is where it really will all come together. One of the tricks with pie crust is to not over mix it. So this, while I do want to mix it thoroughly, I don't want to continue to mix it after it's done mixing. That doesn't make any sense, but you'll see it. So it's still fairly crumbly, but it's much more, I can grasp it now and do things with it. All right, so I left my rolling pin on the other side of the kitchen. I'll be right back. Now comes the fun part of making pies, and that's rolling out the crust. So if you've done pies before, so this part might be easy for you. Just sprinkling your surface. I have a marble rolling pin. It doesn't matter what kind of rolling pin you use. I've just had it for 30 years, so I know how to use it. I know what the weight is of it. Take approximately half, but on the smaller half of the pie crust. And I form it into a soft, squishy ball and then start manipulating it on the mat. Flouring it as I go so that it doesn't get sticky. So I usually do a couple rolls across, flour it again, and then flip it, making sure that the flour is really pretty much all over the place. I'm not going to flip it anymore, but now I'm going to roll out fairly thin. I like a thin crust because it cooks better. Whoops, and there goes my ice water. And a towel. Excellent. Okay, so that's pretty good and thin. I would say, what do you think, Nels? 15 inches, about 15-inch circle or so. And I'm doing
pie plate on there.
Yeah, I'm doing. That's what the 9-inch pie plate looks like on there. Okay, if you've done your pie crust well, you should be able to fold it in half and gently pick it up into your pie plate and kind of push it into place. And if it breaks, don't worry about it. I've had pie crust break all the time. You just piece them back together, push them down in there a little bit and smush them, and they'll be just fine. That's one of the good things about making pies is they don't have to be perfect in order to taste great. Men just love pie, so make pie, no matter what it looks like. So before I add the rest of the ingredients to the apples, I'm going to roll out the top crust, same way. Sometimes there'll be some crumbs down in the bottom of the bowl. Don't worry about grabbing all of those, especially if they're really dry, just leave them down there. And again, kind of a small disc of dough. and repeating the process of flouring and mashing and turning. A little bit of rolling and then one turn and then I'm done turning. And you'll know that if it needs more flour because your rolling pin will stick to it if you don't have enough flour on it. Okay. That one is just fine and thin. All right, so my hands are very messy. There's no reason to clean them up. They're just going to stay messy for this next part. This can sit here, the pie crust can sit here. Now we're going to deal with the apples. So to the apples, I'm going to add about 1.25 cups to 1.5 cups of just white sugar. 1.25 cups is usually plenty. It needs enough sugar so that it makes its own juice and counterbalances the sour. But then we're also going to add just a little bit of flour to soak up the juice, and then you've got a nice, slightly thickened juice in there, so it's not too runny. It's a weird balance. So about, I don't know, 2 or 3 tablespoons of flour, and then generous sprinkles. I'd say 1 teaspoon to 1.5 teaspoons of cinnamon. And then this is fun too. So I'm going to go over toward the sink so I can toss these to coat them, get them. You could probably do it with a spoon. I just like doing it this way. I don't know why. And it doesn't have to be completely thorough, but they're slightly tossed, and you can see that there's at least some cinnamon and sugar on nearly all of the apples. That's all there is to it. So this I'm dumping into the pie crust. This is where, I don't have a deep dish pie crust right now. I just have this shallow one. So it's likely that all of these apples won't fit in here. But I'll do the best I can to get most of them. Again, as it's cooking, the apples are going to cook down, but they're also going to become very juicy with all this sugar on them. So it's that balance of having the right amount in there, but not so much that it's overflowing, making a mess in the oven. So I'm going to stop there, add just a little bit of flour to my now sticky, sweet, and sugary hands, and pick up the second pie crust to put on top. So see how well I've done with how well it all comes together. This guy over a little bit. And there you go. Now, of course, you can get very fancy with what you do with the edges of your crust. That's a matter of taste, and again, it doesn't affect how the pie tastes at the end, so I never bother with doing anything fancy because men just want pie. That's a joke. Women want pie too. So I'm cutting off the excess, but leaving probably 1 inch from the pie plate itself hanging over. Both the top and the bottom crusts are still hanging there. I'm cutting off all of this excess because it would not bake well if I left that on there. It'd be just too thick around the edges. Okay, and I'm just kind of tearing and pressing with the knife to get that off. And there you go. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect. You might lose some of that bottom crust. That's okay. The biggest goal from here now is to tuck that pie crust underneath so that it all stays contained in the pie plate. So again, you can get fancy. I just roll a couple of those edges, and I've got some really thin spots on here, and so I know that's where the juice is going to cook through, but that's okay. So I'm just rolling it under. All the way around. Okay, and I like it inside the pie plate, again, so that it's not, the juice is not going to cook over as much. There should be some juice that cooks over, that's terrific, but I don't want all of the pie crust hanging down and then falling off while it's cooking. Okay, last thing to do, cut a couple of vent holes in the top. That just lets the moisture escape while the apples are cooking. And this is going into a 350-degree oven for about 50 minutes or so. When it's done, it should be lightly browned, and you should see bubbles, pie juice bubbles, either through the vent holes or around the edges where there's some gaps in your pie crust. Okay, it's going in the oven. And hopefully we'll come back in 50 minutes or so and show you the result.